What's up, everyone? This is Mr. Lord, Dark Professor, Dark Joker with this week's video. And this week, I'm going to go over how George Lucas's sequel trilogy could have worked with the expand universe. So, we know that George Lucas gave story treatments to Disney, which, they did not use, they threw away, despite making them believe that they would use them. So, we're going to go over how the plot points in those story treatments could have worked with the expanded universe plot points that existed at the time. How like an adaptation, those two things could have happened, like some potential like general like outline of a story, how that could have gone. You know, yeah, go over what Disney did, what we know about George's trilogy. So with all that being said, on with the video. Here's what we know about the sequel trilogy. For George Lucas's sequel trilogy, what's known is that one, Darth Maul was going to be the main villain, and he would be like the godfather of crime in the galaxy. So the code name used by a production team, whenever George was writing like his story treatments and all that stuff, coming up with some early development outside of, official production, was Uber. And it is likely that the Clone Wars and the unmade TV show Underworld were going to set up the sequel trilogy. So famously, in the end of season 4 of the Clone Wars, um, Darth Maul makes his grand return with his brother Savage Opress finds him. Talzin basically cures Maul of his insanity and gives him new legs. Darth Maul got new legs now. Uh, yeah, just like Lieutenant Dan. And yeah, so Maul, he forms the Shout Collective. We see like the first two in throughout like the Clone Wars. You had the first one that was formed basically disbanded after he as Son of Dathomir comic show that the first Shadow Collective basically disbanded after Maul was captured and all that. And then by the time you get to Siege of Mandalore, the second one has been formed. And so yeah, so and in Underworld that was a mobster show that Lucas had had some scripts for. Basically, the reason it was unmade was because it was going to cost like 50 million an episode, like per episode. Fit like I think if I like that's basically been the most expensive show ever, at least by per episode cost. Like more expensive than Andor, more expensive than Rings of Power, more expensive than probably any Game of Thrones episode. Like holy crap! Like it was going to be expensive, and that's why it was unmade. Now, if Lucas had made it like an animated like sequel to TCW, make it like an Adult Swim show, and maybe getting Tarkovsky involved. Um, yeah, I think it would been very successful and been significantly cheaper to make. But I think some of the plot points in Underworld were probably going to involve Darth Maul and set up the sequel trilogy. Now, to my knowledge, there is no actual official information about Darth Maul being a character in Underworld, but I do think there was going to be. I personally believe Maul was going to play a role. And yeah, and so another plot was that Darth Talon was going to be an apprentice of Darth Maul. And so Darth Talon, the original one, was a character in the Star Wars Legacy, which is a comic series taking place like so Luke, Han, and Leia, like their last appearance, like alive in the EU, like at least that was written, was like in the 40s ABY. And so Legacy takes place like in the late 130s, early 140s ABY. So it's like basically like 90 years after, Han, Luke, and Leia's last appearance. So Talon was a character then. So obviously, if Talon was a character, working for Darth Maul, like his apprentice, it would probably be a different Talon. Who knows how they would explain? Because there was because there was like an unmade video game like called Battle of the Sith Lords, like that was going to have like Darth Maul, like a clone of Darth Maul, work with Darth Talon. Like that was a plot point in unmade video game. And so yeah, so so basically yeah, who knows if Talon was have it'd probably be an ancestor of the original one. So another plot point is that Luke Skywalker would send a message out to Jedi asking for any surviving members of the old Jedi Order to join him to form a new Jedi Order. And there's like around 50 to 100 left. So he would basically try and form a new one so, he could, like, have one established, train some new students and all that, have some help with that. And then at some point, he would isolate himself on a remote planet with, like, an ancient Jedi temple. Now, far as Lucas's trilogy is concerned, I don't know how much of the exact motives behind Luke isolating himself, because in Disney's trilogy, basically, Luke has a bad dream, tries to murder his nephew Ben Solo, who's just a cheap knockoff of Darth Caedus, aka Jason Solo. And basically, Ben Solo runs off, joins Snoke, becomes Kylo Ren, all that stuff. And Luke, you know, basically after his Jedi Academy gets burned down, all that crap, basically gets depressed, goes off on Octu, whatever, and gets depressed over it. And he just stays by himself. And then of course we know he never leaves. He just projects himself, you know, and then dies from using the force too much. So as far as Luke's motives for isolating himself in George's trilogy, I do not think he would be trying to murder his apprentice. I do not think that would happen. Like I do not think that would happen. Like from a bad dream. Now, is it possible that he was not happy about an apprentice joining? That's a maybe. It's also possible maybe due to stuff with the wills being a plot point, maybe he was there for special training. Who knows? Anyway, so one of the new protagonists would be Taryn. So it'd be a 14. She would be a 14-year-old scavenger who would be trained by Luke and was possibly the daughter of Han Solo and Leia Organa Solo. Now, other names for the character include Kira, Thea, and Winky. Um, so yeah, and the other character was Skylar. So Skylar was another teenage protagonist. His exact age is given, but I imagine maybe the same age as Taryn. So I would say he would either have been a stormtrooper turned deserter, which is why he would be holding a blaster, as seen some concept art with Sam and Kira, or he'd be the son of Han and Leia and would fall to the dark side under Talon, becoming a Jedi killer. And Sam was like the alternate name used for Skylar. And so another problem was that Darth Vader's castle would be shown. Now, in Disney, you have like, Vader's fortress on Mustafar, which was kind of explained in the comics involving Darth Momin, which I've not read those, but I've heard those are like far as Disney Star Wars comics are concerned. So this is a very low bar to set, but the Darth Vader run involving Momin was considered to be amongst the better comics that Disney did. As I said, a low bar to set. Of course, in the EU you had Bass Castle on Vijun, so that would be the preferable one to use. Although, I mean, Mustafar is a cool planet, and so their plot point would be like Leia would be helping lead the galaxy, lead the rebuild that's going because the galaxy's still in recovery from the Galactic Civil War. You know, and basically with with obviously the Imperial remnant and stuff, and so obviously you have like everything like going on with that. The government's still relatively new. And that's something that even the EU, that's something the Galaxy continues to deal with is the fallout from the Galactic Civil War. And so by the end of the trilogy, Leia would become the Supreme Chancellor, you know, or Chief of State, as the EU called the political office with New Republic and the Galactic Alliance. Chief of State was a plot anyway. Now some some of the stuff that Luke said that Leia would be the chosen one and bring balance. Okay, here's what I say about that. One, the prophecy. Here's the where prophecy actually says. Here's the truth. Anakin Skywalker's the chosen one. Like you've had people say, "Who's the chosen one?" You have some like different characters within and different people outside, like writers where Troy Denning tried to say Alana Solo was going to be revealed to be the chosen one in his novel trilogy. Due to the throne of balance and all that. Lucas's trilogy was going to say imply, I guess at least maybe that Leia was the chosen one, just by becoming supreme chancellor, I guess. Which no, I could surely tell you a political position would not let that make that happen. And Luke, being the main character in the original trilogy, all the stuff he did, and of course Anakin Skywalker, which based on the nature of his birth, all the stuff that I consider that Anakin Skywalker is the chosen one. Anakin Skywalker is the chosen one. That is just a fact. That will never change. Exactly what balance in the Force means, I've done a video about that previously. But Anakin's the chosen one. And so Luke, he would die in Episode 9, but a new Jedi Order would be established by, around 20 years after Return of Jedi, so around 24 ABY. By that point, there will be a new Jedi Order, and Luke would die, possibly possibly dying, in combat with Maul, like they would kill each other, whatever. Who knows? And then the wills would be explained. So the wills, that's like basically they're like I guess they think they live like in the Force, like because you have the midichlorians, then you have I think the wills are like above midichlorians, like above that. So like basically I think the wills were going to be explained, a lot of the inner workings of the Force, would be explained, which that could be interesting if done well. I mean, as far as like look explanations of the Force go, yes, there's things you don't want to explain. There's things it's okay to explain, like saying how some of the inner workings work, how balance works. Yeah, so the wills being played, it could be an interesting thing, you know, and like because some people had complaints about the midichlorians, because like oh it makes the Force seem like a just some less mystical, which I understand those criticisms. I had no problem with the midichlorians. Like it's like no, there's a way mystic like the mystic stuff could work. Like exactly how the midichlorians work, who knows? But yeah, it could be interesting if done right, and George could be trusted better with explaining the wills than Disney can. Disney better stay the heck away from the wills. So for Disney's sequel trilogy, Disney famously threw out George Lucas's sequel trilogy story treatments, despite making him believe that they were going to use them. The expand universe was decanonized on April 25th, 2014, in order to make a fresh start without being bound by existing canon. Yeah, because you know how Hollywood does not like to be bound by the rules of canon. Yeah, like because you know how was it some people in Hollywood say, "Oh, can't like can doesn't matter. We like to have creative freedom and all that. Like it's so constricting. I'm like, get over it. Go blow yourself or whatever. No, and history will argue that when everyone looks back on this time period in the history of entertainment, it'll be considered that the day Star Wars died was the day the EU was decanonized, like the day it ended. Now, while all hype for Star Wars, while all hope for the return of Star Wars to be back, like that ended when Obi-Wan premiered, when that show premiered. That's when all hope ended. Basically, even if stuff has been good, like even when stuff has been good, like or at least decent, like Pieces of the Past, Vision season 3, guess what? The franchise is still dead. Ninth Jedi I think could be really good this year, and Maul, Shadow Lord might be decent, might not. I don't know. Regardless, Star Wars is still dead. Now, as far as continuity errors were concerned, so when George Lucas ran the company, you had the holocron system that actually dealt with continuity errors because you had so many novels, so many video games, so many comics, and all that. They were bound because yeah, for some people it was hard to keep track with everything. I mean, and basically the holocron system was meant to explain, hey, what took priority when continuity errors happened? Because you had at the top you had the 6 movies with the original trilogy, prequel trilogy. Then below it you had TV Can, which at that point in time, by the time Lucas sold the company to Disney, it was just the Clone Wars. So basically anything in Clone Wars that contradicted the you know the 6 movies, anything like that was going to be non-canon. So any time that Anakin Skywalker met Count Dooku by the holocron system, it was not canon. That is just a fact. And and arguably anytime Obi-Wan met General Grievous, arguably like that could maybe be considered non-canon. But that one, I mean, hard to say, but like definitely anytime Anakin met Dooku, that is should by the holocron system standards, those episodes or that movie is not canon, regardless of their quality. Because I didn't say I didn't like some of that stuff, but it's still not canon. Like I like the TCW movie, it still ain't canon by the holocron standards. Now, but with the other expanded universe, you had stuff that was okay, if it contradicted higher levels of canon, it wasn't canon until an explanation could be made to rectify it. That's how they handled, like, if there was an issue with calendar systems, you know, some lore differences, basically they found ways, some the writers actually put forth the effort and explain it. And of course, you had, some of the issues like the Mandalorians, how they're portrayed, the EU compared to TCW. Some of that could easily just be explained as like, okay, you have different factions of Mandalorians. Some probably not who aren't. Some probably not happy. Definitely not happy with Satine's reforms. And and so yeah, Lucas under George Lucas, Lucasfilm actually tried to deal with continuity and explained to themselves and to fans how what took priority. And people, even if they disagree with some decisions, there was at least a respect for that. Now, as far as Disney's concerned, they said they want everything to line up exactly right, but of course they haven't uh, kept up with it well. Dave Filoni has not done well at keeping up with it. So, for example, one of the earliest it was, the Order 66 in regards to Captain Rex. So, in Rebels, Rex said that he took his chip out, so he didn't turn against his Jedi commander, which was Ahsoka. So the way it was worded, it seemed like okay, he took his chip out before Order 66 happened, so he wasn't affected at all. Which in the Ahsoka novel, that's what that's what basically what happens now, and that's probably what the Siege of Mandalore was gonna involve before Disney finally made it. Like when Lucas ran like some of the early outlines, because some there were changes to some stuff like Ahsoka's walkabout arc. They replaced Nix Okami with Trace and Rafa Martez. Anyway, and so I think with Rex, I think in that point the chip he had already taken his chip out due to the stuff with fives, and I guess you know Wolf and Gregor did the same thing. Now, in regards to what we saw, now overall it's a good arc and on screen, but it showed Rex was affected by it, and then he like it was Ahsoka took it out, and that freed him of the brainwashing. So fully contradicted, then like in because there was like a Kanan Jarrus novel, like comic, or whatever, showing his perspective or 66, then Bad Batch contradicted it. Now, why they had Frey Prinze Jr. voice a young Kanan, it's a little weird. I mean, overall, that season was decent. I didn't see season 2 and 3 at the time recording this. And so, and yeah, and also you had Tony Gilroy with Andor, with like season 2, deal with Mon Mothma's like escape from Coruscant, trying to do his own thing. He wasn't happy with the he was like he basically is like no, he wanted to do his own thing, not trying to keep in line what Filoni made for Rebels. Which I mean, I would argue Rebels did better than Andor. I mean, just saying. And like and so with K2SO, how he's found by Cass Andor, there was like a comic or novel or something dealing that dealt with that. And then you know Gilroy wanted to do his own thing with that and put it in the show. Although what I've seen of how the comic shows how K2SO and Andor met, the comic did it better. Then from what I've seen about what actually I haven't read that comic, but I've seen like some of the basic plot points of what happened. But from what I've seen, the comic did it better than the show. You know, not, yeah. I mean, that's just what happened. And so yeah, so Disney's not been good at keeping up their own continuity errors, like because there's too many egos there. Whereas with Lucas, right, there was a lot more there's a lot more the writers and producers. They took pride in their work, and so they put forth effort in trying to help keep continuity straight. Like there was effort put in, and they took pride in their work. We may not agree with all the decisions they made back then with Lucas Rand Company, but they took pride in their work. Disney, they don't take pride in their work. There's a bunch of egotistical pricks. Now, in regards to Disney threw out Lucas story treatments, but they didn't have a plan. They didn't have a plan for the overarching story. They took some pieces here and there from the EU, from Lucas's story treatments. They didn't have a freaking plan. And then what they did make, they decided to disrespect the legacy characters, disrespect the fans, with The Last Jedi cutting the health of the franchise in half. Like there was like at least by the time release, the franchise's health was in half. Like yeah, there were criticisms for the EU being erased, for Force Awakens, for the novels, comics that were released before Last Jedi. But after Last Jedi, it just escalated. Now, yeah, of course you had hope, with Mandalorian seasons 1 and 2. Rebels, that show raised Filoni's stats. I've covered some of that in my you know, the Rise and Fall of Dave Filoni video. But yeah, but Star Wars is dead. Like the sequel trilogy heavily contributed to the death of Star Wars. Last Jedi doing being the biggest contribution out of anything. I mean, yeah, there's some damage done by Force Awakens, by the end of the EU. But the thing is, the end of the EU was relatively niche. So when it was, erased, cancel all that. Obviously, amongst normies, not really gonna make a big impact for a lot of hardcore fans. It did, but like some were still willing to give Disney a chance, and then Force Awakens happened. You know, basically have somewhat positive like reception at the time. Of course, the reception's gone down, and yeah, Force Awakens did get worse with each viewing. To where I mean, I would argue it should be called Fool's Star Wars Fool's Gold, because of false promises ended up being a bunch of crap. Last Jedi, when it released, of course, franchise was at 50% health, and then the rest of 50% like went down, and all the way to zero when Obi Wan premiered, and it's been the negative health basically since then. So yeah, Star Wars is dead. Sequel trilogy, a significant contributor to that. Now here's how Lucas's sequel trilogy could have worked with the expanding universe. So I would say there are two options in which this could have been done. Option one would have been to make a film trilogy set from 24 ABY to 25 ABY, set in between the two novel series, Young Jedi Knights and New Jedi Order, and adapt like Lucas's story treatments with the EU providing plot points to help write the story. So I don't know how detailed story treatments get, like how detailed they are, but Lucas would probably have a lot more details than some of the current day Hollywood writers, because most Hollywood writers today are a bunch of retards. Um, but there'll still be some gaps in it because the story turns might not is basically just an outline, so the EU could help fill in the gaps when it comes to writing the story. And so basically it'd be a lot of the Darth Maul stuff we put in there. You have also that option two would be adapt the expand universe with Lucas's story treatments, like the plot elements from those story treatments just spread out throughout the story across like many years. Like you could like basically you could like have the story spread out across decades, like like spread across like decades, which could be interesting. You have the basically you have the Shao Collective like being like a lingering presence throughout a bunch of stuff, like funding some things, which could make some sense. Like with some of the some of the stuff that goes on. Now, as far as which one is better, I actually think option two is the better of them, and here's the reason why. Uh, the Skylar Solo stuff. So if you have the plot, if you use of him being a solo kid that turns to the dark side, you also have Jason Solo, who becomes the Sith Lord Darth Kaitis in 40 ABY. So, after killing Mara Jade. Well, yeah, yeah. Spoiler alert for the EU. Yeah, yeah. So, if you did option one, you would have Skylar Solo turn to the dark side, and then 16 years later, you have Jason Solo turn to the dark side. For a lot of normies, and for a lot of fans, some people would say that's just repeat. It would be you're just repeating the plot point over again. And okay, fair criticism. It would be a fair because like no, we're just trying to adapt George's story treatments, and and it's a fair. But why I think option two be better is basically you're just doing the EU. You just expand the story. You're just expanding the story of the EU by using Lucas's story treatments. And so, in option two, you could have the Skylar Solo stuff, him turning to the dark side, happening the same time as Jason turning to the dark side. So basically, instead of just repeating a plot point, repeating it, you would just have both at the same time. It would feel less repetitive, and that probably would like go well with like some people's like saying, oh, you're just like, instead of someone saying, oh, you just lack creativity, so you're just repeating the same plot point over and over again, which was some of the criticisms I guess the EU had with like some of the post Return of Jedi stuff, where like basically for a lot of the post Return of Jedi stuff, it was like you know rebellion versus empire, New Republic versus Imperial Empire, and that's one of the reasons why the Use and Vong were created, is to like you know have an enemy that's a major enemy that's not the Empire. Because you had the Second Imperium and Young Jedi Knights, and but that was just another Imperial thing. Then you had later in that book series you had the Black Sun Syndicate with the with all the stuff with Zestros, and then you had the Diversity Alliance, and which was the anti-human group in in Star Wars during the EU, basically do some stuff the Empire did. You know, you had the whole thing pop up with some humans who did not like non-humans, and the Diversity Alliance was a group of aliens that decide to go against humans. You know, and that's and and so basically the Diversity Alliance and the Black Sun Syndicate, they were kind of meant to be like an alternate enemy thing. Like, and then the use Vaughn being like the big enemy. Because if you just do the Empire again, it would some people find it repetitive. So basically, that's why saying option two would be better, because it would just repeat a solo kid turning evil thing. Some people find it repetitive and means you lack creativity, even though now you're just adapting Legacy of the Force after doing the Lucas story treatment story. But if you just spread it out over Lucas stories over time, since it's a story treatment, it's basically an outline. It's not like a officially produced, fully produced thing. Gives you some leeway. You just expand out. Just have two evil solo kids at the same time. You know, it probably works out. You know, probably expands the whole Second Galactic Civil War thing. Like expands that war a lot. And yeah, now as far as some specific plot points, I'm not gonna get in that in this video. Now, if you want to read, in my review of Force Awakens on Criticalist, which is a very good user-driven review site, where unlike some other review sites that are very critics-driven, Criticalist is user-driven, more audience-based. In my Force Awakens review, I put some more specific for how the sequel Lucas's trilogy could work with the EU. Like I put specific plot points for each option. I'm not going to get into those in this video. If you want, you can read the review and read that yourself. Now, but I think there's ways to do some good stuff with both options, but I do personally think option two is the better of the two. And that's it. Did y'all like this video? Did you dislike this video? How do you think George's sequel trilogy could have worked with the expanders? Do you think it could have? Like if Disney had just adapted the EU, used George's story treatments, which option between option one, option two, which one do you think they would have done? Which one do you think would have been better? Do you agree with me that option two would have been the better option? And if where you agree, disagree, where you have your own opinions about that, you can put on that in the comments, like, share, subscribe, all that stuff. Look forward to the next video.